Welcome everyone to this section on core data concepts, where we're going to be focusing on the measures of data. Now fundamentally, at the core of using data science to solve real-world problems and find solutions to business challenges, we use data. And it's important to understand core concepts of data before continuing on to use it with a variety of methods. So in this section of the course, we're going to be focusing on some core topics to understanding what data actually is. And as we begin to learn about probability, statistics, and visualizations regarding data, we need to take a little bit of time to understand what do we actually mean when we say the term data. So the natural question arises, what is data? Formally speaking, we can think of data as collected observations and information about something, which can be structured or unstructured. Let's think about a few examples of data to get an idea of what we mean by terms like collected information or structured versus unstructured. Imagine that you went to Antarctica and you started collecting information about penguins. Maybe you take a penguin, make some measurements, and then send them back out into the wild. Well, you could start organizing this information, and maybe you give each penguin a unique ID. And then you also do measurements like the flipper length or the body mass in grams. You should notice already the idea of units of measurements and also structure. Here we can see a clear structure in a tabular form, similar to a spreadsheet where you have columns and rows, where each column indicates possibly a feature of this particular data set, and then each row indicates an actual unique measurement of a particular penguin. Now, often when we think about data, we're thinking about numbers, but we should point out that not all data has to be numeric. For example, we could also take note of the sex of the penguin, whether they're male or female. Or you could take note of maybe the color of a penguin's beak, whether it's yellow or orange or bright red, etc. So again, keep in mind that not all data needs to be numeric or even really have some sort of unit of measurement. I should point out this is actually a real data set, and the data was collected and made available by Dr. Gorman at the Palmer Station in Antarctica, which is a member of the Long-Term Ecological Research Network. And you can Google search penguin dataset and you can find more information on it. So we've got an idea that data doesn't necessarily need to be numerical. For example, the colors of cars or the sexes of those penguins, whether they're male or female. And so we have this idea that there's different types of data. And in fact, we can distinguish between different types of data, such as continuous versus discrete data, as well as structured data versus unstructured data. Let's talk a little bit more about this vocabulary of data. So in order to explore some core concepts, we need some vocabulary used to describe them. So we're going to be talking about continuous versus discrete, sometimes known as continuous versus categorical. We'll also talk about structured versus unstructured data. We'll talk about nominal versus ordinal data, as well as population data versus sample data. Let's begin by discussing continuous versus discrete data. So what is discrete data? Formally speaking, you'll often see discrete data described as it can only take certain values. And I like to think of it as there's no values in between values. So let's give you an example of this. Let's imagine you're running a used car lot and you're taking inventory of your cars. And you want to take inventory of the car model. Is it a Toyota? Is it a Tesla? Is it a Ferrari? Etc. This is known as discrete data. The car models can only take certain values. And there's no real values in between values. For example, there's no value that's really in between Toyota and Tesla. The car model has to be one of those certain values. So it has to be a brand or model of a particular car. I should point out that you can also do this with playing card values that have some numbers in them. For example, playing card values have to be ace, 2, 3, jack, queen, king, and so on. There's no playing card value that's 2.5 or in between certain values. So don't get confused with discrete versus numeric data. You can have numeric data that is also discrete data depending on the context. So for example, let's imagine that you're marking down all the possible values of rolling a single die. This is clearly numeric data, but it's still discrete because no matter how many times you roll this die, you're not going to be able to get any other value besides 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So this is numeric data, and it's also discrete data. There is no 3.5 on the die. Now let's talk about continuous data. Formally speaking, continuous data can take any value. That is to say, there's going to be an infinite amount of values in between any two values if you're able to get precise enough. For example, the height or weight of people is a continuous value set. So someone could be 172 centimeters tall or 173 centimeters tall. And we can see this continuous data because there are values in between this that someone could be. So someone could be 172.5 centimeters tall. And if we were able to get super precise with this, someone could be 172.54 centimeters tall or 172.542 centimeters, etc. So hopefully that distinguishes the idea of continuous data versus discrete data. And remember that while continuous data is numeric, such as a weight being 160 kilograms, discrete data can be numeric, like a dice roll of 2, or a string, like the color blue. You should also keep in mind that sometimes the context and framing of a dataset will decide whether you should think of data as continuous or discrete. And in fact, when you're communicating with your colleagues about data, context is super important. For example, let's imagine I just asked you, is color data continuous or discrete? Based off what we just described, you may quickly say, oh, it's going to be discrete, like the color of a car. So you may just want to immediately say, there's discrete values, something is yellow, orange, or red, or green, or blue, etc. But if you start to think about this more like on a spectrum of wavelengths, then maybe the context is more physics-based. So if we're in a physics lab and we're actually measuring the visible spectrum of light, then color starts to become more like a continuous data set. And in this context, but maybe color is not the best word, and I should actually be describing something like wavelengths as a continuous data set. Although technically, if we're only in the visible spectrum, I could use the word color. That's why context is so important here. So now we're really thinking more about wavelengths in nanometers. And in fact, as I mentioned, does the term color even make sense here? So there's gamma rays, X-rays, radio waves, etc., which we can't see. So keep in mind that context is super important, and being careful with the vocabulary you choose with describing data is also going to be very important. And also, don't confuse numeric and ordered discrete data with continuous data. Let me talk about an example here to clarify what I mean. Let's consider an airline with passenger classes. There's a first class, a second class, and a third class. Now, this is technically numeric data. We could say it's 1, 2, and 3. In the same way, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on a dice roll. However, there also is an order to this. So second class is technically in between first and third class. But why is this still discrete? That's because there's no values that are any values that can be taken. That is, there's only a certain amount of discrete values that the data can take. It can only take first, second, or third class. There's no 1.57 passenger class. So this is kind of an interesting example of it's technically numeric data because you could think of it as 1, 2, 3, and it also has a clear ordering, which kind of gives the presence or feeling that some data sets are in between others, but really it's still discrete because the data itself has to be one of these certain values. It can't just be any value on a continuous spectrum. So to help distinguish with this type of data, we need some more vocabulary, and that's where the terms nominal versus ordinal come into play. Nominal data is classified without a natural order or rank. So for example, if we're thinking of categories of discrete animals like dogs, cats, lizards, horses, etc., this is nominal data. There's no real ranking that's official to these particular animals, although we may think dogs are the best animals, but that's for another time. A good test for nominal data is to see if it can be clearly sorted or not. Nominal data cannot be sorted. So if you just gave someone a bunch of species of different animals, there's no real clear definition for how they should be sorted or not. Ordinal data can be sorted. That is to say, it has an order to it. That's ORD, so that's a good, helpful reminder of what ordinal data is. So our previous examples of passenger classes is an ordinal discrete data set. So it's still discrete data, it's also numeric, but the factor here is that it's ordinal. So there is a natural ranking of these items, first, second, and third class. So we understand that second class is in between first and third class. I should also point out that ordinal data doesn't necessarily need to be numeric. So weather data terms, such as it's going to be hot, mild, or cold, those can be said to be ordinal because we can think of hot mild, and cold as being able to be sorted. So from hottest to coldest temperature words. When thinking about continuous versus discrete and nominal versus ordinal, try to keep in mind the context of the problem you're trying to solve. It may not be necessary to apply labels such as ordinal if they aren't useful to the challenge at hand or the problem you're trying to solve. Let's also talk about structured versus unstructured data. So we need to understand that not all data is going to be formatted nicely in a table or spreadsheet. We should also understand that in some cases, you actually don't even want it in a structured format. Structured data is highly specific and is stored in a predefined format. So this could be something like an Excel spreadsheet, JSON files, which are JavaScript object notation files, XML files, SQL databases. They all follow some sort of predefined format. That is to say that as long as you hand over the data to someone else who is familiar with the format, they're going to be able to work with that data. Then there's unstructured data that's not in any particular format, such as audio data or video or text data. That doesn't need to follow any particular predefined structured format. So for example, video data, that can be a short little YouTube clip or it can be a 2-hour movie. And there's no real self-defined structure there. It just happens to be in an encoding format. So be careful not to confuse computer encoded file formats with formatted or structured data. So just because a text is in a PDF format doesn't technically make it structured data, because you'd have to open up that PDF file to understand what you're actually looking at. Are you looking at reviews or are you looking at some legal documents? So unstructured data, again, is not in any particular format where you can just easily open it up in a wide variety of programs. So typically, it's going to be that unstructured data is going to be harder to work with, but in certain fields, it's actually necessary to achieve results. Many state-of-the-art deep learning techniques use unstructured data to learn patterns and generate new objects. For example, you may have heard of DALL-E 2 from OpenAI. It's a deep learning program that is actually able to take custom text descriptions, such as an astronaut riding a horse in the style of Andy Warhol, and then produce an image to reflect the text description. Now, this is a super complex deep learning model, but you get an idea that it actually used unstructured data for its training set. It used unstructured text descriptions as well as unstructured image files, and then was able to eventually learn the relationship between a text description and the output image. And after being trained on many, many images and many text descriptions, it was able to understand, given a text description prompt, what sort of image should be output. And I would highly encourage you to do a Google search for DALL-E 2 to see all the amazing images people have created with this amazing deep learning program. And then let's also talk about population versus sample. So finally, we also need to consider the scope of our data collection. Is this data a full representation of everything available and known, or is it actually just a sample of everything? So population consists of every member of a group. Keep in mind, this is dependent on the context of a situation. For example, a list of all the student names inside of a school contains data on the entire population, because in this context, the scope of what we're looking for is just this particular school. And if we get a list of all the student names in that school, that's the entire population. Here, context is super important. Don't confuse the term population in this context with the population of an entire country. In the context of data science, we use population to describe the entire available data set. Now, often, it's not going to be possible to record data on an entire population. In this case, we rely on a sample from the population, which is a subset of all the members of the group. For example, let's imagine we had an optional school survey that we only ask some of the students to fill out. In this context, that would be a sample of the population of the entire school. We should always try to have samples that are representative of the population we're trying to understand. So having a survey where only 2 students fill it out in a school of 1,000 students is probably not a representative sample. Later on, we'll discover that sample sizes are actually a very well-studied science. So for example, how many students should we survey for a school of 1,000 students to get a representative sample? You can intuitively feel that 1 or 2 students is not enough, but you also have an intuition that it's probably not necessary to survey all 1,000 students to get an idea of how students in the general population feel. So there's actually a really well-defined science to what sample size you need to try to get a representative sample. So in case you're curious about the answer to that particular question, we'll discuss it later on, but it actually depends a bit on our assumptions of the overall population and its distribution and the task at hand. You can find out more now at this particular Wikipedia link on sample size determination, or you can just keep watching along the course and we'll revisit this idea later on. So we've seen that data comes in different forms and that we need to be cognizant of the context surrounding the data and, more importantly, on what we are using the data for. The ability to measure certain features of data is crucial to understanding data sets, especially numeric ones. And I hope the vocabulary we taught you right now is going to be useful in describing your data sets later on. So let's continue on by exploring two key concepts of data measurements. Measurements of central tendency, like mean, median, and mode, and measurements of dispersion, variance, and standard deviation. We'll see you at the next lecture.